Across the globe, birth rates are falling, reaching historic lows. Is this a necessary correction for a world with limited resources, or are we heading towards an existential crisis? I'm Soraya Salam, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
People who are grieving, that's the word they use, grieving the families that they don't have. Now, this is a hidden crisis. People who are grieving childlessness aren't doing it on the streets. They're not coming onto talk shows like this.
I think the idea that I should get married and have children after my personality is fully developed is a very modern idea, and it's one that we don't challenge very often.
So if more men could be fathers and could be part of being fathers, I do think that the world would be a more peaceful place. They would have less hormones and energy to be seeking wars and seeking violence and seeking fights.
But it's an oversimplification and a harmful one at that when we say that we owe or not owe children, because that implies that you should have them, that it's somehow shameful or blameful if you don't.
Our debate today: do you owe the world a child? I'd like to welcome our guests, Stephen Shaw, data scientist and director of the documentary film series Birth Gap; Laurie DeRose, senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies; Alaka Basu, professor of global development at Cornell University; and Antonina Lewandowska, feminist activist and researcher. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about this discussion. Laurie, starting with you, do we owe the world a child? Should it be seen as a moral obligation to create the next generation?
We owe the world children. I'm changing the question. I'm saying that it's we collectively that owe the world children. It is not an individual moral obligation. There are plenty of moral people who have not had children. It doesn't define us as human or as righteous, but a healthy age structure is in the public good, and there are lots of things about children that contribute to society. So we collectively need them, and collectively we need to produce them.
Alaka?
I don't think we owe the world children, and for several reasons. For one thing, I'm a bit alarmed at the way until 10 years ago we were all screaming about the population explosion, and now it seems to be a mirror image of the opposite way we're as concerned. We got over the population explosion, and now we are disappointed that we got over it too far. I mean, we've gone too far. And I don't think in either case, for one thing, I don't think we have a population problem, a problem of declining population that we need to worry about right now. And the second thing is, I don't think I agree with Laurie that one can think about it as a collective responsibility, but eventually it boils down to the behavior of individuals, and which means that it's really women who are at the receiving end of any kind of pressure to have a child,
Stephen?
just like they were under pressure not to have children in the past.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of anyone owing anyone a child. I don't think we need to be framing it in that way, frankly. It so happens that, I guess, through nature, most of us want to have children. The vast majority of us do. And I think that allows us to reframe this question to simply look at, are those people who want to have children having them, able to have them, aware of the information that would perhaps enable them to make better personal decisions about their lives? I think that's the subject matter, not in terms of owing anybody anything. The reality is, if people were having the number of children they want to have, and if fewer people were what I term becoming unplanned childlessness, we wouldn't have a birth rate crisis at all.
Antonina?
I agree with the concern about the framing of the question, because I feel that saying that we owe children to anyone basically reduces them to a commodity that we should be providing. And that's not the case. What I believe should be considered in that regard is that we owe people creating a space that is welcoming and supportive of being parents, and of having planned children and of having loving families. But it's an oversimplification and a harmful one at that when we say that we owe or not owe children, because that implies that you should have them, that it's somehow shameful or blameful if you don't. That's one thing. And the other is having children is one thing, and creating a loving, supportive family is another. And it's not enough for us to have children to keep the world in a shape as we wish to see it around us, because we need loving, supportive families. We need financial resources to bring up these children. And there is so many different factors at work that definitely I strongly disagree with the phrasing of the question.
I mean, could I just also add? I think there's another framing issue here because the question implies that we can just choose randomly to have a child, particularly as women, but obviously it involves men too. It's not that simple. Things have to line up, including finding a partner, finding stability in your life. So the idea that we can say we owe people, the world, children, again, it is a vast oversimplification as to how complex this issue is.
And yet you did call it a crisis. I want to just read a quick statistic. By 2050, over 3/4 of countries will not have high enough fertility rates to sustain population size over time. This will increase to more than 95% of countries by 2100. That's according to the Lancet Medical Journal. So what consequences could this have? Should
And
we be worried?
yeah, most of this is already baked in, certainly the 2050 number, simply because there's already so fewer potential parents in many countries in the more developed world and increasingly in the less developed world. So we cannot change that outcome even if we wanted to. So for example, Japan, where I live, if births were to go up to replacement level, it's a horrible term, but it's what we mean for the average family size being around 2 children per woman. If that were to happen tomorrow, and of course it won't, total population in Japan would still be destined to fall by half, simply because of the children that were not had over the past 5 or more decades. So the consequences, to more directly answer your question, touch, I would say, everything. I mean, I would struggle to think of anything that they will not impact. And some of those things you may say might be good things. There might be less stress on the planet, but it still will have an impact. Most of the things socially and economically are negative, potentially very negative. We've built our economies on growth. Like it or not, that's what we have today. And it starts with how we invest, how we create companies, how we sell products on one side. And it's quite cold to talk about that, perhaps in terms of birth rates, but it's reality. It ends up with how we support older people, how we support pensions, and how we support the healthcare of older people. Because the vast majority of expense related to healthcare is focused on the over 70s, the over 75s. And we're looking at a world, like it or not, where we're going to be poorer in one way or another because of this. And again, we can't change this for the decades ahead in many, many nations. So we have to adjust, we have to accept it. We have to, I think more than anything, educate younger people as to the future that they're going to have.
We assume that everyone wants to be a parent, everyone wants to be a mother, and we attribute the even the voluntary childlessness to something deeper, not finding a partner, etc., or not, for example, finding gender equality and being lumped with either looking after domestic duties as well as going out to work. But it could also be, and I think there is some evidence from, I was just reading a paper in population studies, I think, about women who, in fact, groups who, this was in Scandinavian countries, groups that women who actually experience the largest amount of gender equality, in fact, have also moved on to think that then childbearing is not the part that I'm not being restrained from having children because my partner is willing to help me. But in fact, the gender equality that I have has reminded me that there are many things in life besides having children. And I've changed my views, I've changed my goals, I've changed my aspirations. I can get satisfaction. I myself have children, so I'm not speaking at a personal level, but I fully understand friends who think that their life goals and their interests in life can be very separate.
And as the only man at the table, Stephen, what role do men play in addressing what you consider a crisis?
The trends for men and women are exceptionally similar. Men seem to have this idea that they can delay things longer than women. It's only by a very few years. In reality, if you look at outcomes, So I would say that everything we're talking about around this table applies effectively as equally to men as it does women. And I really would call out to men watching to really stop the delusion that we can wait until our 40s, 50s, and that because we biologically mostly still can become fathers at that age. The reality is that the vast majority of men without children at those ages do not become fathers, often because they just don't meet the right younger woman in that case to become a parent.
Yeah, but I'd like
Please.
to say actually something. Talking about men, I almost think that men need to become fathers much more than women need to become mothers. I do think that there is a crisis of maleness and masculinity, etc., taking place right now. So if more men could be fathers and could be part of being fathers, I do think that the world would be a more peaceful place. They would have less uh, hormones and energy to be seeking wars and seeking violence and seeking fights. So I think, in fact, children are men, even if they don't realize it and abandon their children and their mothers, need. If we are going to tell people about the value of children, we need to be telling that more to the men than to the women. Women, in fact, I think, have bear such a big burden of childbearing that they can see the negatives. Men have been able to think they've got away scot free, but they're the losers in the process. I think fatherhood is good for men more than motherhood is good for women, is my
I,
sense.
I'm not sure I could agree with that. I mean, if you look at in the U.S., I'm sure you're familiar with the CDC National Family Growth Survey. Thousands of women and men interviewed mostly in their homes over many, many decades. We're finding that somewhere around 90, even 95% of women in their fertile years either have or want children. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, frankly, on those people who don't want children. I think mostly we're agreeing that we should respect that. I certainly do.
Or people
But
who can't have children and want,
yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah.
That's where the real issue is here when it links to birth rates. So I don't dispute what you said. Maybe certainly I see younger men now in their 20s, often lost career-wise, lost educationally, just lost in life. That may be linked to the fact that they would more normally want to be fathers at that age. It might be. But the real issue here comes back to those people who want to become parents, significantly, certainly women who are childless for life.
Why not just recalibrate to a world with fewer children?
Well, we're going to have to, in some
It's
ways. Degrowth
inevitable. We
is
have
right.
to do
Yeah,
it.
Yeah.
the reality is, developed economies and increasingly developing economies are going to have to confront degrowth. And,
Yes.
when I studied an MBA 30 years ago, I think every single class we took was about growth in some context. I'm not sure that that has changed anywhere, but it's going to be about how to manage degrowth. And that's not going to be easy. That's not just something that we can sit around this table and say, yes, let's do that. There's going to be a lot of societal and economic challenges. But in terms of uh, accepting long-term low fertility, in doing that, we're actually accepting that it doesn't matter in our societies that actually the majority of childless people actually wanted to become parents. We're just going to ignore that. If we are caring people, we would want to address that. Whether that's a big number or small number, we can get into the details of that. We should be caring about those people. And the data certainly, I would say, would show that we will not have a birth rate problem. We will get to a point in future, decades from now, of stability in terms of populations, where populations are not shrinking and not growing equally. That to me is the goal, but that's 50 years away, best case.
Easily.
Yeah. Antonina, I mean, he brings up a point of should we, from a societal level, should we care that people are having fewer children? How do you respond to that?
I would say that the discussion that we are having is, at least for now, partially focuses on individual choices, which is one thing, but we don't live in a void. And each of us as an individual lives in a system, in a society. And the system is failing currently. It's failing people that want to have children. It's failing people that either struggle with infertility, and the healthcare system is still underfunded grossly around the world. And people simply don't have the resources sometimes to get help. So that is something that we should definitely focus on more. We should focus on developing education as well, because at least in some cases, it was noted that the decision to postpone or withdraw from the decision of having children altogether also comes from the concern for that children's future.
We don't tell young people about the fertility window, about how long there might be to have a child. And we have data for this that we're actually ignoring. Everything here comes back to delaying parenthood, causing, I'm going to use a strong word statistically, causing, because it's so clear in the data, causing a drop in the likelihood of ever becoming a parent.
Technology is moving ahead very rapidly. Let's not forget that. Every time we've come up with dystopian images of the future, in the past when it was Malthusian, when everyone was worried there wouldn't be enough food, we had an agricultural revolution. Then we had an industrial revolution. Now we've got this technological revolution in reproductive assisted reproductive technologies, and we're at the start of that. Technology is there to meet that demand, and it's moving very rapidly. And I wouldn't be surprised if 15 years from now the IVF success rate shoots up. I also find it amusing that all these things we are saying, we said exactly the same thing for the opposite problem when we had too many children being born. We talked about sex education, we talked about education, we talked about technology.
Mhm.
We said all these things of contraceptive technology, and now we are talking about IVF technology. But contraceptive technology met the demand, and that's why birth rates came down.
So, Stephen, do you accept technology will come to the rescue?
No. So I'm going to be bold here with respect to Alaka, and I'm going to make a prediction that it won't, because we've got decades of data. We've got decades from countries that have had technologies, and you would expect by now to see some uptick, and it's just not happening. So for me, actually, the question shifts, not contradicting, I think, anything you've said, that there's something else driving this. There's something deeper. And that something deeper, I think, is people not having a partner at the right time. So you get to 38, you've frozen your eggs, everything could work out, but you just had a divorce.
No, I agree with that.
You think, Antonina, about this fact that, if people are having fewer children or choosing not to have children, is that eventually creating a society in which people aren't passing down tradition, culture, and in that kind of break in generational inheritance?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so because we've had historically situations where the younger generation was eradicated for whatever reason. Say it was a war or it was a pandemic or something happened, and it's not that we lost or all that was around us, the culture, the history. So I think there are ways, especially as a person that's coming from Poland, our history is very twisted and complicated. We actually didn't exist on a map for 123 years. And so many would say that, well, the nation must have collapsed. And that wasn't the case. Actually, when we regained our independence after the First World War, the culture was booming. And there was so much that people were sharing despite coming technically from different countries because there were partitions and they were living in different nations that actually, took us over. So that's not the case that the culture would disappear because we always pass down something. We have written resources, we have digital resources now. Many people are seeking their heritage and then trying to unpack it, figure out, and carry on with traditions that they may have not even known in their childhood. It's often a case for adopted children, for people who are trying to seek their roots and then they just adopt it and carry on with who they feel they are. That's one thing. And the other is we also come up with new traditions. Each and every family, I'm very sure that every person in this room and all of the viewers have their own small traditions that they pass on. Of course, it's not a cultural code that everyone would universally share and agree on, but at the same time, it's not that it doesn't exist because society is created and upheld by our participation in it and our activities. So it's not about losing something, it's about constant redefining and finding that new common and shared ground.
Do we have anything to lose in a world with fewer children? I mean, do we have, on a collective societal level, do we have anything to lose in a world with fewer children?
Maybe we should go back to the first point. What do we mean by fewer children? Do we mean fewer children in the world, or fewer children in specific countries and specific parts of the world? Because all estimates suggest that we are still going to go up to some 10 billion, and at the global level, the population is continuing to grow. It's true, it's not growing in the Western world, but it's growing in the other parts. It's going to reach 10 billion, which is not a small number. So, if you think about it at a global level, I don't think that's a worry. The problem, of course, is that we don't want to think about it at a global level. Each of us has our little islands, whether that island is a country or my family or my community or my religion. And so we are talking more in terms of that level of concern, that are there too few of me, my kind? We are not talking about are there too few people. And so that is a different conversation that we should be having in terms of how we then deal with the problem of too few births.
But is that, I mean, can you expand on what you mean by that?
It's most of the concern about fewer births comes from economists who cannot think outside the idea of continuous growth. GDP, is it growing by 2%? Is it growing by 3%? But I think there's a case to be made in rich countries for slowing down. So, if the economist argument concern is about growing too fast economically, that argument, I think it's time we consider slowing down in both production and consumption and destruction of the environment. So that's one part of it. We need to think about ways that we adapt to fewer births, that again adapt to fewer births which are voluntarily fewer births. I don't think that I don't mean that we don't help women who want children have children. If there are ways to adapt, the most obvious one, of course, is a redistribution of the population, immigration, but that has lots of issues as we are seeing right now. But there are other forms of adaptation. Degrowth is one, but there are many others which I hope we'll talk about.
I think we have to bring this back to marriage too, which again is getting really conservative. But you've been saying people don't necessarily have a partner at the right time in life. Well, we've devalued marriage as an institution. And it's kind of not surprising that if it can't be counted on for stable families, that it doesn't help produce stable families the way it did in the past. I mean, marriage is non-biological too. It's hard, like adoption and immigration, because it's non-biological. But I'm making the argument that we can socially support it, just like we can socially support childbearing with gender egalitarianism and with generous work-family policy. We can support marriage ideologically and policy-wise as well.
I just had a clarification I want from you, Laurie, because you're the expert on stable families and the impact on children, etc. The thing is, in a country like the US, where the divorce rate is very high,
Really high.
because divorce is easily available, what you're getting, the families that do not separate, I'm assuming, are the families that are happily married. And so, whether you would get the same advantage to marriage in parts of the world where families are not happy but cannot separate, is I'm wondering whether you know anything about that.
I actually have looked at this with respect to two human capital outcomes. One is children's education, and the other one is children's survival, under 5 mortality. So obviously under 5 mortality isn't a big deal in the developed world, but children whose mothers have been through a marital transition are at higher risk of child mortality. And of course, there are many different ways that you could explain that. And it could be some selection and some causation or whatever. But if you then just start talking about the benefits of stability, they show up in education, even in places where marriage is forced, if you will. Basically across the globe, the best educational outcomes are in two-parent families, except, this is really interesting, in places where single mothers are elite themselves. You know, where marriage at a young age is so normal that someone who gets to be a single mother is someone who's exercising a lot of choice and has a lot of freedom within her culture because of her high socioeconomic status.
Beyond the parents, though, I can't help but think of the old adage, it takes a village to raise a child.
Mhm.
Have we lost the village in many places, particularly in developed countries, where it is a two-person job and perhaps historically it wasn't?
If you have a neighborhood where you have that kind of neighborliness that you know about each other's lives, you can support each other in much more important childbearing things than a single wound. There's a lot more to childbearing than just keeping our kids alive. And yeah, I would go up a level from the family as well. I love families. I think we could do a heck of a lot more with neighborhoods. Places in the world where neighborhoods have deteriorated less look better to me than the United States. And then I do think there's a place for government in shaping policy to make family easier.
Stephen?
What can governments realistically do? Well, we have a huge amount of data from multiple countries on what does not work. Giving people cash in their pockets to have children does not work. That shouldn't be surprising. This is a big life-changing decision. Opening more kindergartens does not work, good as that may be. Greater parental leave does not work. All the things, doing housework in the home, men doing more at home, does not work because we have so many examples from countries around the world. And when you look at a country to say, well, we'll look at Scandinavia, it's got this great policy, but then it's got a very low birth rate. Then you look at, education is a great one, actually. So many people in Japan, where education is very expensive, blame the cost of education for low birth rates.
Yes.
But in Germany, education is free, I believe, including through university, in effect. And it has effectively the same birth rate. So we know a lot of things that do not work. So what might work? For me, the evidence, the only evidence really I can see, comes from Hungary, which over 10 to 15 years has had extensive family support policies. And some people might not like all the policies of Hungary. I'm not here to defend Hungary as a nation. I work with the former president, Katalin Novak. We created a non-profit, XY Worldwide, to focus on awareness of younger people. What Hungary managed to do was enable younger people, under 25s in the data, to start families when they weren't doing that before, through giving them access to housing, forgiving student loans for women who had a child before age 30, paying their parents, the grandparents, to be carers if they wanted to be, offering larger loans for larger cars, vehicles, if they wanted 3 or more children. So there are certain things that governments can do. And I would say about Hungary, because I think this is an important point. When I first went there, probably I was under the impression that it might be a coercive country. You hear a lot of things about Hungary. And when it came to family, I went to the first conference, and there was so much discussion about single mothers and the support for single mothers in Hungary, support for the elderly. They had a community discussion about how to bring community together. I felt no coercion there, but I felt one thing. Do you know what? If I were a young person in Hungary thinking of starting a family, I would probably feel that this country supports me.
Yes.
That even if there's a divorce or something goes wrong, this country cares about family. So I think the role of government is beyond policy and more about simply encouraging those who want to have children to do so, and equally encouraging society to understand that not everybody does.
I have Hungarian friends and colleagues who work with human rights, and I would say that it's a slight oversimplification to say that they introduced these policies, and so we have a slight growth, but it may not be enough. Well, Hungary is not the best with human rights, to put it politely, and there is a whole area of social life that is not reflected in pro-natalist policies that may still lead people to not want to have children, like the exclusion of migrant rights.
Stephen, does that make your work more challenging, that there is this dark underbelly of the debate where you do have white supremacists and certain corners of the far right that are citing great replacement theory, and they're afraid of, certain cultures outnumbering, certain colors outnumbering?
I've had to develop very thick skin for
Themselves.
sure. I've had to be cautious about what conferences I go to, about the conversations I have, and I think I've surprised some people by. I describe myself as a pan-natalist, which it's my term, so I get to define it. It means supporting those people who want to have the children they want to have, but equally supporting those who don't want children not to have children they don't have. And I think that's the good middle place we should all be. So for me, if we're looking at government policy, to bring it back, it's not actually about supporting existing parents, although that's probably a good thing to do. We probably want to do that. But in terms of addressing this issue, it's how can we increase pathways into parenthood for those who want it? I think this whole idea of delayed parenthood and what happened from these shocks economically, delaying that first child, creates an environment where people are just not taking early relationships particularly seriously because there's no need to, because we're not telling young people that the likelihood of becoming a parent in our 30s is much lower than people expect. And I think that goes part of the problem here that governments can start to address, awareness of just the reality of data.
Alaka?
Again, I keep coming to this from my experience of the debates around high fertility, where again it was we kept telling young people that you're too young to be getting into a partnership, a serious partnership, and having a child. You must postpone. And we had the WHO telling them how teen pregnancies were bad for the mother, they were bad for the child, they were bad for family stability, they were bad for everything. And now we are saying that no, we should get young people at the of 19 and 20 to think that oh, not he's not bad, he might make a good father. That's it's very funny that it just shows that our ideology or our policy preferences are deciding our ideologies about what is good or what is bad. So I don't think it's a question of just delaying and therefore not. Then you're bringing up the question of involuntary childlessness.
Yes,
I don't think it's that. I think there is a
it
large
is.
number of women, an increasing number of women, who have decided that their motherhood is not for them.
What does data say about men wanting to become parents?
Yes, it's a great question. And again, I'm embarrassed that we have so little data on men, but the data we have indicates that men have a slight less desire to become a father, or less bothered if they don't. You're right to say that there's more childless men than childless women because some men get to marry twice or have children with two families, leaving others who want children to miss out. But if I could just share from the Birth Gap documentary a scene where I interview men, I mean, almost in tears. Many women were in tears. People who are grieving, that's the word they use, grieving the families that they don't have. Now, this is a hidden crisis. People who are grieving childlessness aren't doing it on the streets. They're not coming onto talk shows like this. They're doing it in the privacy of their homes. They're rarely forming campaign groups, so there are support groups online. So the idea that this is a trivial thing for those people, not all who want children necessarily, but a significant minority, if not indeed majority of people who want children, that it's a lifelong grieving episode, really needs to be brought into the public debate.
These men who are grieving, that what's the reason for being childless?
Yeah, well, it
Usually.
ranges. In the documentary, I show 3 or 4 men. One had not met his life partner. He came from academia and had fully expected as an educated person to find that right person. It never happened. The second gave up on IVF after 20 years of trying. A third married someone with children and at the time thought that was okay. And then he realized the more time he spent with her children, the more he needed his own children. And there's various other off-camera ones I've had. These were actually, to me, and I've talked to hundreds of people. I've filmed in 24 countries and continue to talk to many people about this. Probably the most difficult conversations I have had are with men, not all men, but some men who want a family, breaking down, just not knowing what went wrong, just being led into this life of focus on your career, maybe play around, take your time, there's no rush. And I've got some contacts who, childless men who turn 40 and just suddenly, why am I finding it hard to get dates now? All that happened is I'm 1 year older. So I think women have got this, desire to find a certain profile of man, and it's not an older man. I think the reality is that across European countries, Far Eastern countries, the US, Canada, Australia, and beyond, we're heading now for 40% childlessness. Korea is already over that.
Laurie?
The first person you mentioned was someone who hadn't found his soulmate yet. And I'd like to call that out as an ideology that is destructive in terms of partnering and parenthood. That if you believe that there's a soulmate out there for you and you have to find that person, you're not going to deal with real people in the same way. And this one is one that crosses socioeconomic strata. In some of Catherine Eden's work with her husband, Timothy Nelson, she talks about unwed single fathers who weren't necessarily marrying their baby mamas. And part of it was that they were a little bit afraid they might meet their soulmate after they did. And then they'd have to get a divorce. And I'm not saying that was the only thing that was going on, but it's like the idea that I have to maximize that there's something out there, and particularly something that I believe is fictitious, that there's one person that was created for me. I'm not sure where that came from, but it's latched on.
I believe we can blame Plato for that, actually.
Oh, can we go back that
Yeah.
far?
I
Really?
think so, yeah.
Okay, well, I will go back that far.
Well,
How come
half
it's gotten
exists somewhere.
Yeah,
how
have,
come
Yeah,
it's
yes,
gotten
yeah.
so popular
Does
more
anyone
recently?
believe in
Actually,
soulmates
like-
at this
Well-
table? I'm curious.
Again,
Certainly
sorry?
not at this age. We've discovered it doesn't. There's no
Well-
such thing.
So if you look at...
1 second. I think
Sure.
you wanted to get a point
Yeah.
in.
I want to stress, and I will not stop stressing that, you can be a beneficial member of society. You can give to others without becoming a parent, right?
Of course. I think
So
everyone at the
let's
table
just
agrees
stress
with
that,
that.
because
Sure.
I really want it to be out there that this discussion is about you needing to have children, and that we can be amazing people without becoming parents. I blame capitalism for a number of issues that are affecting birth rates and choices about parenthood, about how we shape our life. The fact that that notion of constant growth and racing towards an actually unidentified, undefined idea of growth and perfection, it's unobtainable. We are never going to, end up in the place that we think we should end up, because the capitalist idea is we have to go forward constantly. There is a saying in Polish that it's not about catching a rabbit, but about following the rabbit. It's about the run. So we keep running to catch the rabbit, but there is no rabbit to catch.
The whole point of development, I thought, was supposed to be that you would free people from work, from this constant, constant need to be a part of the labor force. I mean, I remember Bertrand Russell and all talking about 4-week days, 4-day weeks, and 6-hour a day a work day. So the whole point was that you don't keep chasing for more. The point is that once you've reached the level of consumption that the Western world has, we really need to be thinking both about scaling back and about scaling back by letting people do other things.
Soraya, I remember that I didn't actually answer your question about what I believe should be the shape of love and relationships now. And listening to you, Alika, about how we shape and create parenthood and communities, I think we should somehow figure out a way of going back to being a community, of being supportive, of getting to know friends of my friends, or maybe a personal, but I believe quite funny story, that my partner is actually a son of my mom's best friend from university, and they reconnected years later, and then we met and it just clicked. And without having these connections, and there are so many people that migrate either internally in a country or externally, and they don't have their families and they don't have loved ones, and capitalism is forcing us to work 10, 12 hours a day, and we simply don't have the time. And even if we manage to scratch out these 3-4 hours, we are exhausted. And the majority of people would rather just stay in and lay in bed and maybe watch Netflix or just rest, because we don't have the capacity to engage in social life. If we are to solve a number of issues, we have to reshape our approach towards capitalism itself, because we are overworked, we are overstressed, it impacts our quality of life, it impacts our health. And so many issues regarding fertility are also related to health, both mental and physical.
We feel guilty to be free. I know that when I read a novel, I feel guilty enough to, in fact, place it inside an academic book and then read. So
Sorry.
it is it's if I'm doing that at work in my office, I feel I should only read a novel in bed at night. If I'm reading in my office, I should keep some other demography journal under under it. So, but I do think that we need to rethink, and then a lot of these issues, if we recast the meaning of development and move beyond economic growth, especially economic growth that is so harmful to the environment, and that itself, I believe, in surveys show that women who want to be childless or child free, whatever you want to call it, a part of it is actually concern about bringing children into the kind of world we have created, whether it's a physical world or the ideological world or the violence filled world. I mean, I really fear for my children who are now grown up, but even now I keep thinking that when I'm dead and I'm not there to protect them, what will happen? It's such an uncertain, unpredictable world. And with young children, it's even worse. I mean, when you think so, you can be genuinely altruistic from the point of view of the next generation by not wanting children. So I think there are so many reasons for not wanting having children. So this two children is in an ideal world, but as you face the unpredictability and the tensions of the current world, many people want to step back and think that, do I want to bring a child into this? And do I want to leave a child to fend for himself in this kind of world once I'm gone?
I'd like to say something about community, though. I absolutely agree that community is essential. The communities have to come from somewhere. And I don't know where that's going to come from, but we're making it harder for ourselves. If you take nations, certainly across Europe, I imagine parts of Poland, certainly Japan, where shrinking birth rates have meant decimated communities. You know, Japan has something like 6,000 schools that have closed in the last 15 plus years, 2 per day. 2 schools per day are closing in Japan. You close a school, you lose a community all around it. So what happens is younger parents move away. The older people tend to stay there because where the younger people are going to is more expensive. So you create these environments through falling birth rates. I call it the birth gap trap, that actually we have to swim upstream to recreate a sense of community in an environment where, you know, young people and are moving away. So we've got decaying societies against us here as well.
But wouldn't you agree that creating these systemic changes, I don't think there is a single fix. There is not one thing, that there is not a wave of a wand that we can do that will fix the situation, but it
Yeah.
would be an improvement. It
Yeah.
would create a new space for people
Well-
to try and even ask themselves a question, well, do I want to be a parent?
We need dramatic changes, and I've got some things to share on that. I don't know if now's the right time.
Well, I was just going to say, I wish we had more time because
You're really
we
gonna
could
stop
keep.
us?
I really don't want to. I promise, but we could talk about this for hours. I really wish we had more time.
I believe we
I-
have talked
I
about it
would.
for hours.
I believe we have. I mean, a few more hours. But I want each of you to have a final word. And Stephen, please finish your point, but
Yeah.
then do me one over. If you can let me know, for the young people who are listening to this, what do you hope to leave them with after this conversation? And I want to hear from all of you on that question. Go ahead, please.
So to finish my point first, I believe we need fundamental changes. Tinkering with policies has been tried and has not worked. We have to accept that. I think it means reinventing education. I'd like to see us change to lifelong learning. I'd like to take a year out of high school. I'd like to take a year out of college. And I'd like to see younger people be able to start working earlier, helping to define what they actually want to do long-term career-wise, but having that happen over future, summers, future evening schools to get the qualification that's really valid. Now, in doing that, I think will enable people to have more independence earlier.
Laurie?
Hard to sum up. However, I'm sort of going to respond to the call to frame this a little bit in terms of religion, because there is a legitimate and sincere concern that the more seriously religion is taken as a possible motivating force, the more likely it will be used to cause harm and to coerce. But we also have to, I believe, and I think I could defend this pretty well, embrace religion for its moral knowledge, for the way it calls us to not be all about ourselves and actually be for the other and for God. And so I think that God knows what people need, and they need each other. And we have these bodies and we need to create new bodies for the next generation. I'm putting the emphasis on the body part again, just to say that part of the social reproduction has to include biological reproduction. I am all for cutting back on workism and capitalism, but it's not enough.
Alaka?
Yeah, I think I brought this up at the beginning, but I'm saying it again, that I think we are more than individuals. We are social beings. That's important. But we are not, which is what social life has been reduced to. We are not Americans versus Nigerians versus Hindus versus Muslims, whatever it is. And actually, to me, the nationalism that motivates much of this pro-natalist talk and motivated the anti-natalist talk earlier is something very disturbing. That it's so. In fact, was it John F. Kennedy who said, "Ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do." I think we need to reverse that.
Antonina, what do you hope young people take away from this conversation?
Well, when talking to young people, I usually say, be rebellious. Be brave and be rebellious because the system is broken and we need to fix it. And it's up to us. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you're not smart enough, that you don't have a seat at the table. Because when talking about the future, we are talking about the world of the younger people. And we have a vision and we have a voice and we have an idea. If you want to be a parent, enjoy that. If you need more time and want to explore yourself, take that gap year. If you want to have the time for yourself, if you want to contribute to others in another way, volunteer, seek out others, go visit that sisters or grandma or someone who may need you to even bring hot chicken soup because there is no one else to do that. Just be a member of community, even if it's very seemingly insignificant.
Thank you so much. I have to agree with Antonina that this was a brilliant discussion. I really
nailed
enjoyed
it.
it, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you.